What are the parallels, if any, with Miami? Let's talk today with Ken Reed. He's the Director of Sports Policy at the League of Fans, which was founded by Ralph Nader. Rod Gilmore, you know, is an ESPN college football analyst. He is an attorney by training. You certainly know Skip Bayless of First Take here on ESPN. He's worked in Dallas through the entire SMU drama back in the 70s and 80s. Paul Finebaum, his radio program Assigned Listening, wherever college football matters. And David Ridpath is a former NCAA compliance officer and a voice for reform in college sports. And that's our starting five today. David, you have lived at the intersection of assignment of blame and NCAA investigations. We give Miami the presumption of innocence, which is all any school, any individual would ask for. But what's out there with the documentation, what you've seen reflecting on SMU, what do you think the prospects are of the death penalty coming into play here?
Well, I mean, I think certainly the allegations and what's been essentially proven are damning, but I don't know what the rest of the panel thinks. But even with something this bad or even worse, I highly doubt, based upon what President Emmert just said, I think he said in not so many words that the death penalty is not going to be given under any circumstances because the effect would be too drastic, much more than it was in 1987. There's no doubt that SMU suffered, and certainly their institution brought back football slowly. But I will say in this case, while the death penalty might be warranted and certainly would fit under the willful violator clause, in my opinion, I highly doubt that we'll see the death penalty enacted.
Paul, it sounds as if we just heard David say that it's not even practical to have it on the books because it's too big a device.
Well, it is too big, and I agree with David, but if someone should get the death penalty in this case, it ought to be Donna Shalala. She's an embarrassment. And Bob, that's the first time I've seen that video. And I'm just thankful that she's the president at the University of Miami and no longer a presidential cabinet officer, because I can't think of enough adjectives to describe how embarrassing that was. And I think she ought to be held accountable, and I think she ought to be fired.
Well, let me just play devil's advocate here. We did invite President Shalala to appear today. They did not respond to her office to the invitation. Here's a rogue booster. They ran a background check on him several years into his appearance on the scene, but there's no proof extant that the school really knew. That's what the school would say.
Well, listen, there doesn't have to be proof. The fact that she's so clueless to say what she did is reason enough to get rid of her. And the think that Mark Emmert is complimenting her, I find that part of the NCAA practice here the most hypocritical, and I bet David agrees with me because he's been down this road personally.
David?
Yeah, I mean, Paul is absolutely right. President Shalala is an embarrassment, as is former athletic director Paul D., who served as chair of the Committee on Infractions. I do have a personal connection to this case because the compliance officer who was threatened by Mr. Shapiro in the press box is my former assistant. And clearly, if you have a booster threaten your main compliance guy in the press box in front of God and everybody, and then you do nothing. In fact, you just don't do nothing. You actually enable this guy more. To say that the institution didn't know and didn't enable this guy is pretty ludicrous, and certainly Donna Shalala absolutely is as responsible as anyone, just based on that press box incident alone.
All right, Skip, you were there in Dallas firsthand. You lived through it, all the revelations, early 80s of probation, mid 80s of probation, Dale Hansen's remarkable investigative piece that brought out the case. Yet again, after 2 probations, they were still paying it. The former governor was involved. There was an absolute establishment of a system here. There's no suggestion that existed at Miami.
No, what one rogue booster alleges that he did is not in the same league with what SMU had done over an 11-year period. They had been on probation 5 times in the previous 10 years, got busted again and put on probation in 1985. And that Board of Governors you refer to, then headed by the governor of Texas, Bill Clements, decided to continue that system that was already in place, whereby SMU recruits were promised they would be paid a monthly salary. Bill Clements said, Board of Governors, let's continue this for another year. Hence the death penalty for the system that was in place. I don't see any way that what Miami has done through this one rogue booster, depending on how much Donna Shalala actually knew or didn't know, should be spoken in the same breath with what SMU did in the 1980s.
All right, Rod, your take.
Well, I think looking at SMU as a precedent is almost useless because the environment has changed dramatically. We're just not going to see an SMU situation, and we're not likely to see the death penalty given to Miami or anyone else. And I really think that the tools that the NCAA is using, those tools are ineffective. They have to go to a different model. Yes, you have to deal with incompetent management. You've got to sweep people out when that happens. But you got to start hitting these universities where it hurts, in the pocketbook. There has to be some sort of financial impact, some sort of fine or something to that point where it makes a difference so that the president, the athletic director, and everyone associated will take some interest in what's going on. Clearly that wasn't the case here, and simply talking about vacating wins and reducing scholarships isn't enough of a deterrent to get anything done.
All right, Ken, your organization has proposed massive changes, and maybe 18 months ago might have seen suggestions from yourself and Ralph Nader, and folks said, oh yeah, sure, but this is the gentleman, Ralph Nader, who eventually put safety belts into every American car back in the 1960s by talking about that issue. So I think it's worth listening to what your take is on this, how effective NCAA management here is, and how practical the death penalty is in this situation.
Well, I think it's clear this is one of the most egregious scandals we've had, of the hundreds we've had. I think, whether you compare it to SMU or not, I think they both deserve the death penalty. I agree with the others that I don't think they will get the death penalty. But I think the key issue here is that we shouldn't be talking about Miami or USC or Ohio State or the death penalty. It's an ill-conceived system at its core. The whole thing needs to be changed. We're dealing with economics of billions of dollars here, and we have commissioners, we have ADs, we have coaches, we have TV executives. Everyone's making a big buck off these kids, and the kids aren't making anything. So we propose a two-step system. We need to pull this tax-exempt status that these big-time BCS schools are getting. They're operating as nonprofits, which is crazy. We got to pull that, make them be a for-profit association of their own under the umbrella of the university, but it's a for-profit college-sponsored club team, basically. You can pay these kids. Scholarships could be part of the compensation, but you can't go on talking about Miami and Ohio State when the whole system is ruined.
We could put up a list. In fact, I think we'll have an opportunity to put up a list of the major college football programs, both currently and in the recent past, that have either been under investigation or proven to have run afoul. And Rod, I noticed as Ken was making your points that you were nodding in agreement. And there's that list with Georgia Tech, LSU, Michigan, USC, and West Virginia having been found guilty, and everyone else either being looked at currently, and we know the situation certainly at Ohio State. They've had their day in front of the infractions committee. What did you see? What were the merits of the argument that Ken was making, Rod, that you agree with?
Well, the system is under fire. It has a problem. He's absolutely right about the economic impact. I mean, what we have now with the amount of money flowing to the universities through TV rights fees and licensing, merchandising, and the like is really unprecedented. And these players are aware of it. And having a situation where you tell them, for example, you're an amateur and you can't license or market your name or your rights, but we can take yours and we can license and market that. They don't get that, and it's totally unfair. But the notion that the NCAA or the member institutions are going to agree that they're going to pay players, that's not going to happen. They are deathly afraid of having their players become employees. They won't agree to that. But I agree that the system has major problems, and you've got to make some changes. I just don't think they're going to make them employees.
But let me ask you this, Rod. Even if you accept that argument that there's some hypocrisy in the system needs fixing. We're talking about a booster here. We're talking about nightclub entertainment, allegedly prostitution, things of this nature. I mean, this is not a stand on moral principle here to avail yourselves of those services because the school is making money. I mean, there is a difference between taking something on the sly and standing on principle, is there not?
Absolutely, but let's be clear here. The NCAA has moved well away from the notion that it matters what a university knows or not. I mean, ask USC about that. It is no longer a standard that, well, you have to have knowledge. And with that being the case, they're responsible for the members who come into their program, boosters or others, and do things that are illegal. They're responsible. It's almost a strict liability standard for them. So they can't get around it by saying, well, the president didn't know, the athletic director didn't know, the head football coach didn't know. That's no longer the case. And you're going to have these things crop up, and all I'm saying is trying to make a deterrence by the death penalty or vacating wins and reducing scholarships is not going to be enough to change behavior. There's got to be a financial impact.
Paul, you are right down there in the heart of SEC country. I'm going to ask you to listen to this next soundbite. This is also from today's conversation between Reese Davis and the president of the NCAA, Mark Emmert, and the question put to Dr. Emmert today about the possibility, and it's been out there, of these, as we see these conferences coalescing into super conferences, whether the major, specifically college football schools, might just up and leave and do business on their own. This was Dr. Emmert's response today.
First of all, I think that's exceedingly unlikely. I know there's a lot of discussion about it, but the level of interest in doing that, I think, is pretty close to zero. I haven't talked to a president or an AD that's really interested in doing it. I don't think anyone wants to take over our roles in running championships and providing enforcement and setting rules. And if you stop and think about it, people say, well, they might want to go off and do something in football. But, you know, we went down that road back in the 80s, of course, as you remember. And in the end, people said the NCAA is still a very good organization to be a part of. And the upsides to being a member vastly exceed the downsides.
All right, so Paul, where do you think the needle is moving on this topic? I mean, the SEC is the center of gravity financially, economically, in a television entertainment sense in college football. Where do you think the needle is moving on this?
Well, I think it's moving away from Dr. Emmert, and if he would come out of his ivory tower and quit staying at suites at the Ritz, he might talk to real people that I talk to every day, and they don't like the NCAA. They don't believe in that process, and you've heard the panel discuss the hypocrisy and the problems within the system. But I think college football is moving toward that, and I think it's moving toward it pretty quickly. And I think it ought to move away from the NCAA because people like Dr. Emmert sound good and they look good on television, but they have simply lost all touch with reality.
All right, Skip, we've got to hold the mirror up to ourselves.
Hey, Paul,
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to jump in and agree. I think the horse has left the barn here. It's way past whether the NCAA can rein in Division I programs. These BCS schools are money-making machines. They have athletic directors and coaches that get hired and fired based on how much revenue they bring in and win-loss. The hypocrisy of the student-athlete term is getting repulsive. I mean, we got to... They're getting tax-exempt status. That's got to be pulled back from by the Department of Justice or some other form of government, because that's not deserved. That's nothing to do with education. We got to get them out. They form their own for-profit association. The rest of college athletics should be under the Division III model with no scholarships, where these kids are treated like every other student. The underprivileged kids can get need-based aid, and we go back to kids going to school to be students in the Olympic sports and the smaller basketball and football programs that don't want to play this for-profit game. They can go to the Division III model. Everyone's a student. You get need-based aid if you need it, academic aid if you need it, and the big-time programs have to be separated. The only honest, fair system to the student-athletes at Division I football and basketball is to give them a piece of the pie. I mean, this is crazy. Billions of dollars, and the people providing the product get a dorm room and some food, and that's it.
Yeah. David?
Maybe who knows? I mean, a big percentage of them may or may not want an education. So an education to some of us is valuable, but a lot of these kids would rather just, you know, start their pro career.
David, from your vantage point, there are hundreds of millions, billions of dollars certainly at stake. Checks written in television money. CBS, this network, ESPN/ABC, certainly, rights acquisition, Southeastern Conference, the various conferences, the BCS, CBS's long, multi-billion-dollar long-term basketball contract. How much power do the TV networks have in what the future are going to be, whether it's going to be an NCAA model, something else, some hybrid reform?
Well, I think that there is some power by the TV networks, but I'm of the opinion, and this goes back a few years, but when I had a conversation with Lauren Matthews and Mark Shapiro, who you know, Bob, they said basically they are putting on the networks what the colleges and universities are giving them. So if the model is changed, and I do think Ken and representatives of our two organizations have spoken, and we're of the same opinion. I think that the horse is out of the barn, and I think the TV networks will adapt to whatever model comes forth. And I do think that the big-time schools need to separate. We often preach that we're giving kids an education, and certainly someone like Rod Gilmore, I think, obviously got an education, but we're not even delivering that now. To say that somebody gets a free education and that's enough compensation in this environment is ludicrous, especially when we're more worried about eligibility maintenance and a public relations academic progress rate, which does nothing towards educational attainment and true education.
Skip, where are we going to be in 2 years on this?
I'll tell you where we should be in the next 10 years. These student athletes should be paid at the highest level, the Division I level. I think ultimately they should be paid whatever the market would bear. But the question on the table when we started this conversation was the death penalty. Does Miami deserve the death penalty? And even though I advocate and have for years that the student athletes should be paid, I think we should give the death penalty to the death penalty. I went through it with SMU, and it was the equivalent of dropping a college football nuclear bomb on that program. It burned it to the ground. And Bob, you mentioned early on, maybe it's just now recovering. I don't even sense that.
It's been 25 years.
It's been 25 years, and it was devastated. It's too much, and I know Emmert needs to rattle saber and threaten this just to maybe scare off some other potential Nevin Shapiro's out there.
So basically, the bottom line, the death penalty, not practical. Ken Reed, Rod Gilmore, Skip Bayless, Paul Finebaum, David Ridpath. Gentlemen, thanks so much.